Okay, my name is Gregory Moss, and this paper is entitled The Logic of Absolute Freedom. One of the perennial objections to Hegel's thinking is the accusation that Hegel has deified human thought. The objection proclaims that human reason is finite, and further proclaims that by imbuing reason with infinite powers, Hegel has not only misunderstood, but also failed to appreciate the limits of human reason. However, if we read Hegel closely, we find that Hegel is very attuned to human frailty. His attentiveness to the frailty of the human being is accentuated by his proclamation in the Phenomenology that we ought no longer think for the concept, but we ought to allow the concept to think for us and for itself. Rather than imbue the human being with powers that she does not have, Hegel calls on the philosopher to forget herself in order to think God's thoughts after him, to use a famous expression from Kepler. It is true that for Hegel, by detaching herself from her own thinking, the philosopher can think the self-conception of absolute thought. But this consists in tracing a movement of thought for which she herself is not responsible. This thought is constituted by the progression of categories in the science of logic. It is absolute self-thinking thought, to which the human being does not herself contribute. Rather than deify the human being, Hegel has endowed God, so to speak, with infinite powers, not the human being. By giving all the power over to the divine concept, whose thought we follow, Hegel systematized the radicalization of the omnipotence of God that is characteristic of the thought of the Protestant Reformation. For Protestant thought, at least in its initial phases, the omnipotence of God demands that the human being does not contribute to her own salvation. The freedom we experience in thought is not one that we have independently of the absolute, but we attain freedom in thought by participating in God's freedom. By following the thought of the Logos rather than one's own proclivities, Hegel's philosophy is also characteristically Greek, for it calls us to heed the Logos of the cosmos. Thus, Hegel's philosophy can overcome such objections. Given the radicalization of the power of the divine Logos that is constitutive of the Protestant Reformation, one might have the opposite worry, that Hegel does not endow the human being with sufficient agency. This objection can be met by recognizing the role of the rational animal and the role that it plays in transforming the absolute into absolute spirit. Hegel's critique of mysticism is instructive for this point. By denying that the absolute is conceptually determined, the absolute for Hegel ceases to be absolute. Without existing in knowledge, the absolute cannot be absolute. Thus, in order for the absolute to be what it is, namely absolute, it must exist in discursive knowing. Because the human being is a discursive thinker, the human being can think the absolute by following its self-particularizing conceptual activity in logic, nature, and mind. Since the absolute comes to exist in knowledge when the human being knows the self-particularizing concept, the absolute achieves absolute status only in the human knowledge of the absolute. Thus, Hegel's thought of the absolute in his threefold system of philosophy is the self-knowledge of the absolute of itself. According to Hegel, God is God only insofar as he knows himself. His self-knowledge is further a self-consciousness in man and man's knowledge of God, which proceeds to man's self-knowledge in God. Close quote. In order to become a vessel of Weltgeist, one must efface oneself, as Hegel makes clear in his famous preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. One must forego abstract thinking in order to realize the identity of the absolute with relative knowledge. One must cease to think that true thought is reducible to one's own thought as a separate finite agent. Rather, true thought is the reconciliation of God's thought with human thought. It is the self-knowing of God through me. What is more, because the absolute engenders its own non-being and self-alienation, one can know the absolute because the self-alienation and other of the absolute is engendered in and by the absolute itself. This is reflected in Hegel's insight that the human being is the mind of God. Through this self-particularizing of the absolute takes a human form and is alienated from itself, from which and through which it knows what it is. For Hegel, truth is not just the correspondence of a concept with a separate object, but the self-correspondence of the concept with itself, engendered in the reconciliation of particular with the universal, the reconciliation of the human being with God. In and through this reconciliation, one can recognize one's own absolute and self-determining singularity. With what this indicates is that Hegel's endorsement of the synthetic unity of apperception, or self-consciousness, as the being of the concept, at the outset of the logic of the concept, is not at all an indication of a deflated metaphysics. Rather, Hegel demands that Kant's project can only be fulfilled if the concept becomes the principle of its own existence. In the final synthesis, this means nothing less than the absolutizing of self-consciousness. Since the absolute comes to be absolute by coming to exist in the mind of a knower of the absolute, by knowing one's own knowing of the absolute, one knows the absolute itself. Knowing the absolute itself means nothing other than knowing one's own knowing of the absolute. In terms of self-consciousness, by taking the absolute as the object of one's knowing, the subject knows oneself. Or the other way around. By knowing oneself, the subject of knowing, one knows the object of one's knowing. Hegel's Kantianism, therefore, is nothing less than the absolute overcoming of Kantianism. For absolutizing self-consciousness is ultimately nothing less than an affirmation of something very much like the intellectual intuition which Kant meant to guard against. Transforming the relativity of the concept, at work in relative self-consciousness, into an absolute principle of its own existence requires the transformation of relative self-consciousness into an absolute self-awareness that achieves knowledge of its absolute object by means of the absolute concept. In giving up on all foundations, Hegel's philosophy also gives up on the intellectual intuition of the early Fichte and Schelling as a ground of philosophy, but this does not mean that the concept of intellectual intuition never reappears. Instead, it arguably requires that it not be taken for granted as the foundation of philosophy. Because the absolute can be absolute only by existing and knowing, by knowing the absolute overcomes its relativity and exists absolutely. This is nothing less than the intellectual intuition of the absolute, and something very similar to Kant's sense, for the conceptualizing of the absolute engenders its existence. Hegel recognizes that just as the identity of synthesis and analysis arises only upon the completion of the logic in the absolute idea, so the intellectual intuition of the absolute can only arise upon the completion of the whole system of philosophy. Accordingly, upon the completion of his system of philosophy, Hegel invokes Aristotle's definition of God, thought thinking itself, nous that intuits itself. This self-intuition of the absolute, however, cannot succeed without us and is not devoid of all potentiality and plurality, as in Aristotle's case, but is constituted by the manifold determinations of logic, nature, and spirit. Given that the self-intuition of the absolute cannot succeed without us, and the absolute being of the absolute depends upon its being known by means of that self-intuition, quite unlike McDowell's absolute idealism, Hegel's absolute idealism does indeed, in an important and highly qualified sense, threaten common sense that the world does not exist without us. Independently of the absolute self-knowing of absolute existence, the absolute is like a seed that has not yet blossomed into full maturation. Looking from the position of absolute knowledge back at the ancestral past of absolute existence, one can say that anterior to the absolute self-knowing of absolute existence, the absolute exists as that which is on the way to absolute being, as that which is complete in the sense that the character of being, not yet absolute, is realized in each and every stage of that development. Its potential to be absolute is carried along with each stage of development and fully actualized in philosophical self-knowledge. Since the absolute becomes absolutely absolute by means of the absolute self-knowledge of a rational species, the correlation between rational self-knowing and being is the final stage of the development of the absolute. Although at the level of logic alone, there is only a correlationism of being with the agency of the concept, the absolute existence of the absolute demands a correlationism of being and a real rational agency, such as the human being. This developmental correlationism can account for the ancestral, what exists anterior to givenness, since it is not posited at the beginning but at the end of the system. Instead, by completing the system with correlationism, one can account for the ancestral and the ancestral aspects of the absolute, while simultaneously giving an account of our knowledge of it. The development in the science of logic is the process by which the concept determines itself to be the singular principle of logic, nature, and spirit. This three-in-one, the singularity of logic, nature, and spirit, constitutes the complete scientific transformation of the Holy Trinity into scientific form. For Hegel, the absolute is constituted by a theogony. God, or the idea, as long as it remains merely logical, is not absolutely absolute, for insofar as it is a non-natural or non-spiritual way of being, it excludes nature and spirit. Accordingly, it is only in virtue of its self-particularization in nature and spirit that the absolute can be absolutely absolute. Simply put, unlike in the Christian tradition, God remains incomplete before he enters the world of nature and spirit. For Hegel, the absolute certainly is logically complete in its conceptual self-development, independently of the creation of nature and spirit, and the existence of nature and spirit certainly do depend upon the existence of logic. Nonetheless, the absolute is not absolutely complete independently of its instantiation in nature and spirit. For logic does not sufficiently constitute all domains of existence. Patricia Marie Carleton tracks this distinction with the concept of the internal and external trinity. Whereas universality, particularity, and singularity constitute a purely internal trinity, the unity of logic, nature, and spirit all constitute an external trinity, whereby the sun constitutes the moment of nature. The absolute concept becomes absolutely absolute only in virtue of its natural and spiritual history. The ontological argument, constituting Hegel's science of logic, is only one element of a three-part development, the complete articulation of which requires the self-particularization of the concept in the domains of nature and spirit. As Hegel points out in his lectures on the philosophy of religion, what is needed is a self-elevation to God. Our knowing of God, according to Hegel, is nothing other than this very self-elevation of the human to the divine. Accordingly, it is not wrong to insist that human reason is coextensive with divine reason. And further, Hegel's ontological argument is not a dialectical sequence performed by a human being about a separate being. Rather, as Harrelson puts it, the ontological argument is a dialectical activity that is known because the human knowledge of God participates in God's self-knowledge. Quote, whoever grasps or comprehends that being is the concept, that is, whoever gazes from the summit of absolute knowledge and thereby understands the inferences of the Hegelian logic, also perceives the existence of God via participation in God's self-knowledge. Close quote. The Christian tradition, like the Greek one that preceded it, offered Hegel further resources for reconceiving the absolute as singularity. As McGee points out, Hegel had no hesitations identifying himself as a Christian. In the Christian tradition, the Word becomes flesh in the person of Emmanuel, and it becomes flesh solely on its own initiative. In Hegel's system, the self-particularizing God freely particularizes itself in virtue of its own initiative. By rethinking universality as singularity and infusing conceptual life into the pictorial vision of the self-particularizing God that is characteristic of Christian belief, Hegel freshly engages both ancient Greek and Christian philosophy. As he writes concerning the ontological argument, quote, our present standpoint is that of Christianity. Here we have the concept in all its freedom. The concept of spirit is the concept that has been in and for itself, but what has been thus distinguished, though it may at first appear as something external, devoid of spirit, extra-divine, is identical with the concept. Absolute truth consists in the development of this idea. In the Christian religion, it is known that God has revealed God's self, and the very being of God consists in revealing God's self. Revealing is self-distinguishing. What has been revealed is precisely that God is revelatory. Close quote. Just as the Christian religion recognizes that true monotheism requires a self-particularizing God, so Hegel recognized that no true conception of the absolute is possible without recognizing the singularity of the self-particularizing concept. In the course of our reconstruction of Hegel's concept, we have painstakingly reconstructed Hegel's argument that the universal individuates itself. In virtue of its self-particularizing character, the universal differentiates itself into two distinct forms, the particular and the universal. Upon differentiating itself into these distinct forms, self-differentiation differentiates itself once again. This time, however, self-differentiation negates the separation of universality and particularity that is constitutive of particularity, thereby giving rise to singularity. This process of self-particularization endemic to the life of the singular universal constitutes Hegel's appropriation of the ontological argument. No longer an argument and no longer indebted to foundations, the concept becomes the source of its own existence. What is absolutely true, itself by itself, auto kath auto, is the principle of its own existence, such that even our own self-knowledge must be conceived as a function of the free concept. Its truth does not depend upon anything except itself. Hegel's defense of the ontological argument against Kant's critique places him squarely in the tradition of modern rationalist metaphysics that proceeds by means of ontological arguments. Indeed, Hegel's endorsement of the ontological argument places him squarely in this long distinguished tradition from the scholasticism of Anselm to Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, whose concept of the monad Hegel invokes in order to clarify his concept of the object in the Encyclopedia Logic. Hegel's metaphysics, however, has fulfilled the promissory note of freedom initiated but not yet completed by the revolution of thinking that constitutes modern rationalist thought. The endorsement of the ontological argument is systematically connected to the concept of a self-particularizing God that is constitutive of Christian thought. As the role of the human being indicates, Hegel cancels and preserves Christian thinking in his own system. The systematization of the Protestant Reformation, in which the human being's role is diminished to zero, initiates a dialectical process in which the human being's role is maximized. As the scriptures have it, by losing oneself, one finds oneself. Quote, "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Close quote. Hegel systematizes the dialectical aspect of the Reformation. By eliminating human freedom is realized. Because the Absolute does not know its absolute being without minds that have the potential to know, the Absolute can only achieve absolute self-knowledge in the mind of the philosophers who know the Absolute. Simply put, the philosophical knowledge of the Absolute is the self-knowledge of the Absolute of itself. In this sense, Hegel's philosophy is not disenchanted in the usual way people use the term. Instead, Hegel means to return the human being and the human history to the absolute center of being, since the self-particularization and self-completion of the Absolute only comes to fruition in her self-knowledge. Hegel's heterodoxy consists in making God's self-knowledge dependent upon the knowledge of particular beings. Since the particular being is herself an instantiation of the self-particularizing absolute concept, the human being can be absolutely self-determined without sacrificing the omnipotence and freedom of the Absolute. Although the absolute idea is logically complete without the aid of human knowing, or at least some form of mind capable of rational knowing, which may take the form of alien life, is not only a necessary self-particularization of the concept, but also necessary for the self-realization of the absolute idea as absolute spirit. In the self-knowing of philosophy, spirit absolutizes itself. Although the absolute idea as a logical category does not require absolute spirit to be what it is, or any phenomenology for that matter, the knowing of the absolute idea in the mind of the philosopher becomes a necessary condition for the absolute idea to exist as a stage in the development of absolute spirit. Without a knower that exists in the domain of real philosophie, the absolute concept could not come to exist in the form of science and its species, namely the science of logic, the science of nature, and the science of spirit. It is often said that Hegel's critique of Kant is actually an effort to complete Kant's critique of reason. Certainly, it is true that Hegel radicalizes Kant's critique of pure reason. The radicalization of the critique of pure reason leads to the end of transcendental philosophy. Far from leaving metaphysics behind, the critique of transcendental philosophy constitutes a return to metaphysics, to pure reason, albeit to a critical metaphysics. As Bernasconi puts it, any Hegel without metaphysics can only be the corpse of Hegel. This is nowhere more obvious than Hegel's innovation of nous upon the completion of his system. This is nowhere more obvious than Hegel's invocation of nous upon the completion of his system. Hegel returns to metaphysics by means of the self-overcoming of transcendental thought. But this return does not leave metaphysics unchanged. Rather, the return to metaphysics not only brings an end to all foundations once and for all, but transforms the absolute into the self-particularizing singularity, or Einzelheit. The absolute must die in order to live, and God must be crucified in order to be resurrected. The historical Good Friday must become speculative. In the words of Richard Dean Winfield, death to metaphysics, long live metaphysics. Thank you.